Loud. Lovely. If anybody feels weird about being recorded, feel free to jump off. I can send you the recording later. That's no big deal. But yeah, so this is an event of Denver data storytellers. I think most of y'all are familiar. You've probably seen my emails, but if you haven't, we're essentially a meetup group of data professionals in the Denver area who really do storytelling, as part of our work. And so we really try and focus on the communications aspects related to data. And so, the work of data journalists really falls into our wheelhouse. And we're especially excited to talk with Andy about how he leverages government data, because the government has access to such interesting stuff if you can access it and engage with it in a meaningful way. So let's see, anything else? Any other announcements? We try and do events roughly every month. We're going to have actually an exciting event coming up in September. And I can talk about it, but David, you've been a little bit of a mastermind behind this. You want to share a little bit about what that's going to look like?
Sure. So this will somewhat mimic the Makeover Monday process that, if you're familiar, was fostered within the Tableau community, especially within Tableau Public, but is really open to any visualization tool. They don't really do it strictly for that, although you'll see most examples in that follow that track. But what the Makeover Monday concept is, for those that aren't familiar with it, it is essentially a visualization is presented, maybe one that is kind of fantastic, really kind of hits a home run as far as its visual storytelling, or maybe one that maybe misses the mark a little bit. But in essence, is the visualization, the story, as well as the data set are presented then to the group. And essentially what they do this every week. So the group is essentially given a week. Individuals can then work on it. They may try replicating the visual if they think that it's a really good one. They may even step outside their comfort zone and go to a tool they're not familiar with yet. Try to do it in there. Or maybe the case where they feel that maybe there is another story avenue that they can take with that visualization, and take that data and essentially own that story and make it more relatable to either to themselves or potentially another segment of the community. But that's in essence what we're going to be able to try to replicate on that.
Yeah, and it's going to be, I think we're shooting to kick this off somewhere around September 16th. We'll do essentially a 1 week for your sort of data viz makeover. And then we've got a panel of judges set up, including David and a few others that will help us evaluate the vizzes that different teams submit. So if any of y'all have an interest in fielding a team, we'd love to have you. There is actually going to be some cool prizes from Slalom Consulting, who's our partner for this event. I think they're going to give $100 cash prize to the top 3 entries. So actually something pretty, like I could deal with another $100. That would be useful. So yeah, data viz contest that's coming up next month. That'll be our next thing. And actually it's going to be really fun because we're building off of this event and using a data set that Andy helped us, or Andy used and published on Twitter, and is sort of donating for our contest. So Andy, we can talk about that later. But yeah, so anyway, welcome everybody, Denver Data Storytellers Group. The last logistical thing I'll share, if you're comfortable sharing your video, please do. It's nice to see, other people on here, but no pressure. I totally get sometimes, hey, I didn't do my hair today, that's fine. So yeah, make yourself at home. Feel free to, throughout this, type in the chat questions that come up too. I know that many of you submitted some really thoughtful questions for Andy when you registered. So I shared those with him. He's kept some of those in mind. But feel free to pop in the chat and or come off the mute if you have something that you want to ask or a comment that you want to share throughout this. I think we can be fairly informal. We don't have a huge group here. So anyway, that's all I've got. Andy, I'll turn it over to you. I gave the shortest of intros. So maybe if you want to just start off providing a little bit more introduction of yourself. And then I know that you had some slides, so feel free to kind of launch into that when you're ready, okay?
Yeah, thanks for having me. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yep, totally.
Great. Well, I'm excited to talk to you all. My name's Andy. I'm currently a reporter at Colorado Public Radio, and my job title is a public affairs reporter, which basically entails covering state government first and foremost, but I use it as a very broad umbrella to have an excuse to go write about everything from evictions to unemployment to whatever interests me that week. I used to work at the Denver Post and then Denverite before that, and I was in North Carolina at the News and Observer before that. So kind of been all over the place in journalism for 11 or 12 years. I had a brief stint as a legal investigator, a private investigator. That's my dog. Which was very informative in terms of navigating courts and government agencies and stuff. Overall, I'd call myself a data adjacent journalist, data literate journalist. I probably have very little that I can tell any of you in terms of programming or analysis or computation. But what I do want to talk about is where to get the data that you use in the first place, because I think this is probably a weak spot for a lot of reporters, frankly, and I'm sure it's just as difficult if you're outside the profession. So let me just jump right into it. I'm gonna be presenting off my screen, so if questions arise, maybe Paul can call it out audibly so I can hear that.
Yeah, I can field those, no big deal.
Okay, let's see. Share screen. There we go. See you. Well, I probably should have done this. How do I make it big? Does anyone? There we go. Okay.
Present.
Thank you.
Looks great.
All right. How to find more data, starring me. The chart that Paul was referring to was a pretty simple one. This wasn't exactly it, but I mocked this up for it. And as you can see, this is a measurement of how many evictions were being filed in Colorado throughout the pandemic. And it tells a really simple story. You can quibble with my design choices. I made it in Excel, but it basically shows that evictions were almost non-existent in April and May when the pandemic was really hitting and people were really worried that people would be thrown out of their homes. So the governor had instituted a ban on evictions. And I should have added some data labels, but essentially around mid-June, you can see they start to accelerate as government protections expire. And then probably 12 of the 15 minutes I spent making this was figuring out how to put the dotted red line in, which represents a kind of an average or a normal level. So a real quick, simple story here of evictions picking back up, but not back to their full level. The tsunami that we've heard about hasn't quite materialized yet. But when I posted this and when I started using it in my journalism, it got quite a big response. A lot of people, there was nothing like this really out there. And I didn't just get, a decent number of retweets or what have you, but also I heard from a lot of people who are really engaged and involved in this housing sector who were saying, where did you get this data? And I heard from somebody like, I've been searching for days for this. I've been Googling for days. And even just last week, like a month later, I got an email that says, I heard you were the guy with all the evictions data. I was like, yes, I am. And the reason that this data was so hard to come by and that people were so amazed by my stupid bar chart was that this is not something that you can Google, the ungoogleable data. So let's pause here. I want to share a quote from a journalist named Ed Young, who's done some phenomenal work recently on the pandemic. But here he's giving advice to other writers. And he says, remember that most writing problems are actually structuring problems, and most structuring problems are actually reporting problems. In a nutshell, what he's trying to say is when you have writer's block, it's probably because you're trying to write things in the wrong order. And if you can't figure out the right order, it's probably because you don't actually have all the information that you need. Basically, you can't tell a story that you don't understand yourself. And so what I find is for myself, in any number of articles that I've been trying to muddle through and just get it done some way or another based on what I found on Google or what my spreadsheet says, if I'm tremendously stuck, it usually just means I have to go out and investigate in the real world or do some reporting in some way. It happens all the time. even 12 years into my career. I think the same quote applies equally well to data forecasting, visualization, whatever you're working on. If you're having trouble making something good, it's probably because you need to go out and get more data. And let's return to my chart now. The problem that was roadblocking everybody else was that you can't search for this information. It's not public on the internet, but it is public information. So this is a snapshot of the weeks-long email back and forth between me and court. That's literally just the court system trying to get the data that I wanted. And it turns out that you had to do this you had to file addendum A, of course, which is on like page 97 of some PDF that you would never be able to find on your own. And you have to send it to a very specific email address, and then you have to wait 15 business days. And it is really this archaic ritual dance that you have to do to get what you want. And I probably never would have guessed how to do it myself if I had just been poking around. So not only could I not Google the data, I also couldn't even Google how to get the data. It did turn out that the instructions for doing this were buried somewhere on like courts.state.co.us/data that Andy wants. But the thing was that, the government websites are terrible. They very rarely tell you what you need to know. They very rarely even like highlight the right information, blah, 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 blah. So the way that I figured out how to actually get this data was that I used the power of human contact. And that's a fancy way of saying I basically called up this guy named John, who is the public information officer for the state court system. I said, John, here's what I'm trying to do. Can you point me in the right direction? That's my favorite phrase for this kind of data search. Point me in the right direction. Because usually people don't know exactly what you need to do, but if you start with someone who's tangentially connected to what you're trying to do, they usually at least have an idea for someone else who can help you. Now, granted, John was predisposed to help me because he knows I can put him on blast for not being helpful, basically. And, I have the imprimatur of being a reporter and stuff. But, I mean, the guy's job title is literally public information officer. Public information is right in the job title. So folks like this, they help me. They can also help you. Other folks who can serve this role of pointing you in the right direction of data include researchers like academics, community groups, and legislators' offices. And basically, whenever I'm looking for a certain set of information, I start out by casting a broad and indirect net where I say, I know I want to know about evictions. I can't find it by directly Google searching, but I would bet that, gosh, who handles evictions? The courts. Let's check out the courts. Or maybe there's, you could do the same thing searching for housing advocates, etc. For public information officers in particular, despite the job title, they do kind of like to make themselves hard to find so they don't get too many emails, I guess. The three ways I like to, and that's not really fair to most PIOs, but some of them do it. The way I like to find them is you can usually check the website of the government agency for a communications, a PIO, or a contact page. You can do my favorite trick of searching Colorado State Court's press release, and they usually attach contact information to that because they want to get calls back about it. Or the fail-safe, call the main line and ask for the public information officer or ask for who's in charge of communications. They will usually put you in touch with the right person. Once you have found the person who you think is hoarding the data that you want, I do a couple things to make it easier for them to provide it to me. For one thing, for example, with this evictions thing, I think I told you that there's a 15-day turnaround, 15 business days, which is so long that my article was due next week. I can't wait 15 business days. And also the data is going to be outdated by then. So what I did was I asked, do you already have any existing data that kind of matches what I'm looking for? Because they were saying, put in your request, we'll get around to it. We'll pull the extract from our system, which is nice of them. But when I asked that second question, what do you already have? they said, oh, yeah, we pulled a very similar extract yesterday. If you just fill out affidavit C or whatever that thing was and describe what we already have, we'll give it to you instantly. So I was able to speed up the process by doing a little bit of research, basically just asking, how do I make this quicker for myself? And then the other thing is, all this stuff is public record. The easiest way to get your hands on it, you can also usually ask, basically, I tell the person, here's what I'm looking for. Here's the question I'm trying to answer. What data sets, what records do you have that might be relevant to that, and how do you store it? They're usually willing to answer that because it makes their job easier. And then there's the fact that they're not always going to cooperate. Sometimes you got to file a records request. There are few laws. I'm not going to get deep into these, but you can definitely research them. CORA, Colorado Open Records Act, that's for most state and city level records in Colorado. CCJRA is for criminal justice records. I don't know why it needs its own law, but it does. I don't anticipate a lot of you are going to be digging into that. FOIA is just CORA for federal requests. And the big thing is that the government has to generally provide you with public records, and they have to do it at a reasonable cost. In Colorado, they charge you $30 an hour for the work that they're doing. The first hour is free usually. That can add up, but for a couple $100, if they're really being obstinate, you can use this records law to get what you want. And it was recently modified, the Colorado law, to include sortable files, meaning spreadsheets, databases, etc. So I'm not going to walk you through best practices for records requests, but do go to Colorado FOIC, the Freedom of Information Coalition. They can get a little bit deeper into that. One other thing I wanted to touch on was that what I'm describing, like going out into the real world and calling people and asking them to help, is really quite scary and difficult. And actually, a lot of reporters I know got into journalism because they wanted to get over their fear of being shy, essentially. So this is a challenge for even people in the profession, is like, oh God, I got to pick up the phone and talk to somebody. The way I get over this is that, whether I'm looking for a data set or working on a story, I try to define for myself what my question is, what I'm going to ask this person. I write the questions down before I get on the phone, before I get out into the field, including, in this case, it would be like, where do I find data that tells me whether or not evictions are happening in Colorado right now? As the third point says, I ask people how they would do it. I find smart people and I ask them, if you were me and you were trying to solve this problem, what would you do? And then I generally try to minimize the inconvenience to the other person, especially to the overworked courts administrators who I'm asking to, go out of their way to pull a Excel spreadsheet for me. And they were quite nice. They even made their own pivot table for me instead of just handing me a glob of data. So I really appreciated that. But the main thing is that you got to remember that you're doing whatever you're doing for a good reason. And that's kind of the ultimate motivation in navigating all this bureaucracy and getting over your fear of talking to people on the phone. And so that's how, that's the kind of complicated process that ended up with my crappy Excel chart that did quite well in terms of supplementing our journalism and getting me in touch with more sources and illuminating something that a lot of people were talking about in very vague terms, but they hadn't been able to nail down themselves. And I'm happy to take some questions about how this could apply to all of y'all's worlds.
I have not seen anything in the chat, so if y'all have a question, just unmute yourself.
Hi, Andy. Sorry, I'm not on video, but just a quick question. I mean, how do you even know what data is out there if you can't Google it? I mean, how do you even know what you're supposed to be looking for?
That is an excellent question. And that's where the power of that social networking really comes in. I basically just try to think of people who are adjacent to the topic. And I'll share the slides again after this, but it's those people who are working on it themselves, researchers, academics, and public information officers. And I call and I just ask them, like, what's out there? What ways are there of measuring this? What do you have? And it's I think it points to this, it's this totally different kind of searching where Google is hyper direct. Like, if Google has what you need, it connects you straight with it. But when you're doing journalism or some of this style of research, you need to master this kind of indirect search where, there is no straight path to where you're going. But instead, I throw out a really big ring of interest and questions that gets me started. And then I try to make the ring smaller and smaller until the answer pops up. I'm not sure if that metaphor really makes sense, but that's how I think of it.
All right, I'll ask another question as well. So do you get the data? So what are you getting? Like, are you getting databases that you can manipulate and do your own research? Are you getting just kind of top level, this is what an agency is telling you the data is? Is it everything in between?
It can be both. Often enough, a public information officer will just answer my question because it's easier that way. But in this case, they were sending me Excel sheets that captured the data. That captured their own records on it, including, so I learned that they track this data in a certain way. And actually, let me pull it up and I'll show you what it actually looks like. They track the data in a certain way internally, and so they were able to share it with me fairly easily. And this is what it looked like when it arrived. As I told you, they made a pivot table and everything. And I'm trying to show you the other tab. Oh, this is the wrong file, but they later shared a different version of this that included actual individual case numbers. So that's, I forgot what the question was.
It was more just trying to understand how much data analysis are you doing of the data versus how much are you taking analysis that's already been done by these organizations?
I see. Yeah, it's both, but I really like when they can provide me the data itself, because then I can get off and running and do my own pivot tables.
So I see a question typed in by Leslie Horna. Thank you, Leslie. Her question is, data is exceptionally helpful in putting the pieces together factually to influence. Data is not as heavily used in storytelling, i.e. public health campaigns like wearing a mask. Can you share a few examples that have successfully married these reporting styles to nudge consumers in a positive direction?
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I find, there's actually a recent New York Times piece where they spent the summer creating their own data on mask wearing by going around New York and measuring the rate of wearing in different neighborhoods. And I thought that was probably a pretty good way to kind of prompt people to look around their own community and think about how they might be able to change their own behavior. I think that in general, best practice for reporters is to find hard statistics and scientific study and throw it in there and not just let both sides argue back and forth, he said, she said forever, but actually provide some context. And then in terms of marrying database reporting and storytelling for myself, the one that comes to mind is more political than public health. I used to report in North Carolina where politics is very no holds barred. And at some point, the state legislature, which was dominated by Republicans at the time, decided that it was going to redistrict Wake County, which is the capital county where all the liberals live. And they kept saying, the narrative that they put out was that this is just kind of rebalancing things. This is totally normal. And it was so technical that it was hard to, the Democrats were saying this is gerrymandering. You're trying to make it easier for Republicans to win. Really hard to get people to get truly invested in that. But eventually I finally got my hands on voting election result files and used them. I had to learn a lot of QGIS and geographic spatial joins and all this crap, but eventually was able to create these maps that showed that the change they had made would have taken an election that was a 7-0 victory for Democrats and turned it into a 6-1 victory for Republicans. And that was all computational analysis that we did ourselves. And that proved to people that this thing was truly outrageous and that actually what the government is doing does matter, and you should probably care about this because it does have an effect. So that's kind of my favorite example of that. I think Matthew asked, did the state data have specific locations tracked? Yes, it did, and that will be in the files that Paul shares. It tracks them at the court level, and it includes information that would let you go a little bit deeper and look up actually addresses and names if you want, but it doesn't have that personal information. It does have, I think it does have city and county level information.
Matt, I see you trying to get a head start on our competition. It's not sneaking past me. One other kind of more in the data question. Then I've got some questions from our registration that we can kind of pop up to in terms of level. But somebody who was this Matthias Stahl, and I'm not sure if he's on the call, but he asked a great question around validating data. Like when you get data from government, is there any kind of validation you do with it, or is there anything that you're doing to make sure that you have confidence that what they gave you is complete enough, or whatever, to answer the question, like it is in fact the right data?
Yeah, we're running into that a lot with COVID-19 data, where there'll be spikes on certain days that are way out of the norm. So part of the solution for that is just obviously looking out for unexpected results. And I really like what the New York Times does with their data dashboard. When there are specific days that have outrageously high numbers, in their visualizer, they'll color them yellow and put an annotation that says, we think something fishy happened here. This might be several days put together. So they'll kind of call out anomalies and explain what they think might be happening there. And then, this is something I'd like to learn to do a little bit better, but in general, I run a couple of sniff tests on my data, especially if I've manipulated it, where, for example, I'm doing a big elections project, and it has involved an ungodly number of pivot tables built on pivot tables because I don't know how to program. And at the end of it, I often will compare, okay, I came up with vote totals for this particular district in this year using my method, which basically uses individual rows of precinct level data and rebuilds them into election results. I'll go and compare that to the actual records that say how many people voted and for who. And if those two numbers add up, I feel pretty good that my data is good and that my analysis is good. So yeah, check it against things that I know are correct. And then of course, do the usual stuff of looking for duplicates. A lot of the data I work with is pretty straightforward. I imagine that with messier sets, it gets a lot more difficult.
Awesome. I have a question from Leslie, another one, around suggestions for efficiently going over data. I think the question really is too, like, have you ever gotten a situation where you've seen like a government agency essentially try to bombard you in so much data that you can't make the details of it? And how might you deal with scenarios like that?
I wish they did that more often, because usually it doesn't work out for them. Yeah, I remember one time I was reporting on some back in North Carolina again. This group of lawmakers were moving to dismantle watershed protections around a big lake called Jordan Lake, and they claimed that they had so much scientific reason to do this. and that they actually had this great new idea where instead of limiting pollution into the lake, they could just install these insane mechanical devices that were going to stir the lake and solve the pollution problems. And I filed whatever the North Carolina public records law, I filed a request and said, like, can you please show me like what you have going on here? Like, what is your justification? What kind of search did you do, et cetera, et cetera. And they handed me a stack of like 600 pages of printed out papers. And they're like, here's all our information. You can tell by the number of pages we printed out that we really did a lot of homework. This is not data per se, but then I read through it and like, it just turned out that a single guy who's not really even a scientist had contacted them. And it basically, they gave me all this data information hoping to overwhelm me, but it only documented that they hadn't actually done their own homework, and most of the stuff in there worked against them. So too much data is rarely a problem. Better than the alternative.
Seeing a question from Lorene. What's one data set that you wish existed but doesn't?
That's an interesting one. I'll have to think that one over. Nothing's jumping to mind right now.
So, Nick, you posed a really good question in your registration, which was, what's your general strategy around formulating story ideas? And maybe, Nick, I could build off of that. I'm curious kind of where the data piece fits into the arc of figuring out the story, you know, and then deciding how to focus and deciding how to research and all of that.
Yeah, this is something I still struggle with. One of the best pieces of feedback I ever got from a freelance editor was essentially, this is a topic, not a story that you're pitching me. Like, you're just saying, I want to talk about X, but you haven't figured out what about X is compelling. And that kind of stung, but it was true. And I still struggle with it a bit. Like, I published a story today that I wrote bass backwards. Like, I was kind of hinting at this, a week digging around inside my insane Excel spreadsheet, hoping that the story would jump out. And I only actually realized what the story was even about after I had already finally convinced myself to leave my basement and go out into the field and talk to voters for this story. And frankly, it was only after 2 hours of doing that, when I finally talked to somebody whose story resonated with me, that I realized, oh, this is about, I won't bore you with the details, but it was only by really grounding myself in and swimming around in the data for a while, and then realizing that I needed to go talk to people and see how what I was seeing in my data set related to the real world and what kind of resonated. It was only then that the story started to jump out. Radio's been really helpful for that, because you really can't get away with telling that boring of a story on the radio. You can tell a boring story in the newspaper and you don't really notice, because, you know, you don't have to say it out loud. But when you're recording a radio story, you're like, my God, this is so boring. Why am I saying this? What am I talking about? So I just try to tell the story to myself a lot, and I try to tell it to friends and see if I can sum it up in 3 sentences, like why. And usually your friends will be pretty honest about whether you're just boring them or not. So it's all about being your own editor or enlisting other people to be your editor and getting reactions to tell you whether something's interesting yet. And if it's not, go do some more research. That being said, like, all my flopping around in this case, looking at my data set for weeks and going crazy, ended up giving me all the pieces so that when I finally had my moment of inspiration, it all snapped together, because I had actually been marinating, mixed 3 metaphors there, been marinating in the data long enough that I was finally able to see the connections.
Awesome. Phil, you had a great question, and I'll read it here and then you can build onto it. So you asked, any advice on tailoring analysis to prevent misinterpretation or misuse? Phil, anything to add before I ask for Andy's thoughts?
Not really. You know, I've worked on curating data sets before, and there's always the fear once you release a data set or any kind of analysis to the wild that then somebody will come along and say, yeah, but we're going to spin that and interpret something different for it.
Yeah, that's a really hard question. And probably this eviction spreadsheet is a good answer, because seen one way, it's showing, well, shit, evictions are on the rise. Like, that's 1,000 people potentially out of their homes in August in the middle of a pandemic. But then it also shows, okay, well, these housing advocates have been talking about this total housing tsunami, eviction tsunami for months now, and it's not here yet. And the way I dealt with that is, I'll actually have an update on that publishing tomorrow, was that I just called up people to check my assumptions. You know, I called up the housing advocate people to say, like, hey, why hasn't this materialized yet? And they pointed out, like, well, we've had a ton of government stimulus that we weren't really anticipating, and people have been able to still pay their bills. But if you look at these other indicators, like demand for food service, demand for food banks is on the rise. And basically they gave me a little more context, and I was able to, even though I wasn't able to necessarily like find a way to show that in the spreadsheet, I mean, maybe there would have been a way, but I don't know how to do data labels in Excel. It at least made it so that as I was writing the chatter, as we call it, the stuff below the chart, I was able to say, like, but this change and that change is still coming. Unemployment benefits are reducing. People are demanding more food. There are signs that this could get worse in September. I even found a landlord who shared that perspective. So a lot of the answer to your question, I think, is just checking yourself, and again, calling up and networking, and not trying to find all the answers within the data set itself.
Yeah, and there were a few related questions here. I'm wondering, maybe you answer them, you know, around like holding government accountable. And I think also in my mind, some of the questions like, how do you know that you're sort of ready to put something out there that is going to be critical, that stands up to, you know, kind of stands up to some of that criticism? Anything additional on that point?
Yeah, a lot of times what we'll do is in the final stages of an investigation, actually it should probably be earlier in the investigation, we'll bring in statistics professors or academics in the area to basically audit our findings. And that's something that might be difficult to do if you don't have an organization standing behind you, because you're asking people to give you their time. But that's a situation where having a clear sense of why you're doing something can really help you convince others to come in and, again, to audit your work, essentially. And then in terms of, you also have to be willing to, you know, to answer Phil's question in the text here, to acknowledge when the data does support, like, whatever the government said it was doing. You know, I think it's only fair to Governor Polis, who's taken a lot of flack for rolling off the evictions ban, to point out that, okay, maybe he was somewhat right, and that landlords aren't evicting people at an incredible rate now that his policy has expired. Maybe he is balancing different factors. So I think we have to be willing to kind of acknowledge when, despite the criticism, government leaders appear to be somewhat right, at least in the short term. We'll see if he turns out to be right next month. I have my doubts. What journalism skills do I think are most valuable for anyone who's creating data-based or data-driven stories? I think that the most valuable journalism skill of all is the ability to see your work from not your own eyes. Like, the best journalistic writers, at least, can read through their piece and realize, like, that's not going to make any sense if you're not me. To be able to look at your work as if you had never seen it before and you were not the one who created it. And I don't know how you get in that mindset, but somehow just trying to free yourself of all the background knowledge and everything that you know, so you can realize whether or not your piece is missing something. And then the other big one is being able to define a central question, so that you have something that's kind of your North Star that's guiding through making all these phone calls and networking and all this.
On this point around data journalism too, we had somebody ask a question, which I think would still be interesting to hear from you. How'd you end up in sort of data journalism, or how'd you end up kind of being the more data-oriented journalist among journalists in the field?
I think I was younger than most people in the newsroom when I started because it was the recession and journalism was in a terrible place, like it is again. So, kind of natural ability to poke around in Excel and figure out computer stuff. And then being kind of an outlier in that sense, I was like, oh, there are so many stories that are right there, and like you don't have to sit around and wait for somebody to tell you what the truth is. You can just dive in and find it yourself. Journalism has an interesting history. They used to call this stuff CAR, or computer assisted reporting, which is basically all reporting now, but it was kind of invented or heavily spread by a guy named Pat Stith, who worked at the News and Observer, and so maybe there was a little bit of a legacy for it there too.
Lovely. What other questions that folks have? I can keep going, but I really want to hear from y'all.
And also, I think sometimes I was trying to avoid calling people, so I'd just try to figure it out from an Excel spreadsheet instead because I was nervous.
Fair. Absolutely. Anything come to mind for anyone else?
Did I skip anybody?
I've got another question. I don't want to monopolize everybody's time, but I'm curious about the notion of like an ongoing story, right? So you get that initial data set, and then you run some analyses on it or something, and then you develop that story. How much do you then turn it into like, hey, here's something that's going on for like the foreseeable future that we're continually collecting data on, and you continually like refresh a story?
Yeah,
how much do you run into that kind of?
that's a really good question, and that's an example where my Rube Goldberg insane Excel sheets come to their limit because that's not a flexible web connected platform, and I think that the organizations that have been investing heavily in that are reaping huge rewards. Like I refer again to the New York Times coronavirus tracker, where like they acknowledged early on that this is going to be an ongoing story and built some really smart, beautiful ways to display that data. And I refer to that constantly because it's an actual resource. And that's kind of a mode shift for journalism. Instead of being like discrete pieces of content that are relevant to that day or whatever, we are trying to, and we really need to find ways to create platforms and resources that people can refer to constantly. My friend and colleague Jim Hill has set me up with some ways to, he's somehow got Google Sheets connected to an API that updates a live chart on the website. So we're moving toward that a little bit, but we don't really have the institutional resources. Like we don't have a programming department. Like Jim is also the web editor and has to get up in the morning and, like fix the copy on the website and stuff. So it's one of those areas where I wish that we did have some tools that were more built around creating a long-standing platform. What role does data visualization play in stories? Important to good journalism. Yeah, it's really important. I think a chart can often say what 3 paragraphs would normally take. And, like visuals in general are so important to any kind of journalism except for radio journalism, because like even the most dedicated reader, we're so inundated with like text and information that even the most dedicated reader really doesn't want to like read through 2,000 words just for the fun of it. Like they need structure, whether that's subheads, and they also need different angles on the same information, which can be a photograph or which can be a chart, because like it can really make especially a long form piece more effective, or even a short form one where I've been telling you this for 2 or 3 paragraphs now, but now boom, you can see it right there for yourself. I just feel like a well-placed chart can really help somebody zoom out in their thinking.
Andy, Leslie shared an interesting follow-up question related to that too, around like, I think that there's an assumption, at least I'm making, that folks' attention span is shorter and shorter. We've got more content coming at us than ever before. So, when you have like a lot of pretty rich data, you found, are there any tips or tricks or ways that you found to navigate and try and either hold attention or responsibly sort of simplify something, knowing that folks, might not have the appetite for really going deep?
Yeah, that's been a challenge for me. And what I learned from my last editor was the idea of one subject, one story, one subject, because I would constantly be trying to fit in like 9 different big ideas into a story. And she's like, why don't you just write another article? Like you don't have to fit everything into this one. The newspaper is going to come out tomorrow as well, as it turns out. And so I think that one of the most effective things you can do is to just segment things out. That's an effective way to build an audience too. Like, I find the, as tech people might like to say, the minimum viable product, the thing that you feel is like a responsible, complete idea that has the context people need to not go off in some crazy direction with it, and try to keep it to that. We live in this age where people, if they are interested in that, they'll follow you, they'll come back around for more later. Parcel it out.
I love that. And it relates to kind of a counter to David, your question, which I think is a really good one. So I'm curious what you think about this, Andy. He asks, how do you visually inform society of the relationships between some of these issues? Like we've got housing, unemployment, public health, there obviously are like important interrelationships there. Probably challenging because there could be a whole lot of a story. David, do you want to add anything to that before?
I think you pretty much covered it exactly. It's that peeling back the layers of the onion. It's all related. How do you best approach that?
That's a great question because, like I was hinting at earlier, these evictions numbers are really tightly tied into the unemployment numbers and the unemployment benefit numbers. And I think that points to the fact that you can't find all the answers in one data set. It's so tempting to try to work with what you have and make it beautiful. But oftentimes it's understanding how different areas and even how different data sets fit together. So if I were to go back and redesign that evictions chart, maybe I'd find a way to pull in weekly unemployment data and to overlay it. And you only really get to do that. You only really realize how those pieces fit together by, again, just marinating in the information and spending time talking to people about it and checking your assumptions until you start to build up a mental model of how this all fits together. And, you really have to I find I really have to create, you can't force genius to suddenly strike or force a great idea. You can't say I'm going to have a good idea now, but you can feed enough information into your brain and show it enough different angles that you create the elements for a lightning strike. You create the thundercloud, and then maybe one good idea will come down eventually if you have the right ingredients. And read. You got to read. You got to you're not the first one ever to take on a subject. Go read everything you can on it.
I love that analogy of you can't create the lightning to strike, but you can create the conditions for the fire.
I think I just came up with that, but it might have been an instance of parallel thought. I'm sure somebody said that.
That's awesome. Any other last questions anybody has for Andy before we wrap here?
I've got one. I'm kind of curious about where you think the field of data generalization is going to go, and whether you think, you've alluded to it a little bit, but whether it's connected to what's happening now or independent of that, what do you see yourself doing 10, 20 years from now?
Still trying to survive. No, I think that you get at a really big question where I kind of believe that the national publications that are investing so heavily in this stuff are going to start spinning out tech products that are going to start making them a lot of money, where like the same way Bloomberg makes a ton of money by not just doing financial journalism, but by being a financial information services company. I don't see why more general interest publications can't start to do that. Like they're going to find specific niches, whatever, specific ideas, and some of their data products are going to grow into like actual products that they sell to people. I think it's going to be a moneymaker for them. But then I don't know about at the local level, like where, CPR is doing better than most, but I don't see where we come up with, $300,000. I could probably pay two really good developers with that, or I could pay 5 journalists a really good wage. So like the locals have been undercut so badly that they don't have any real money to invest in it, and that's probably going to be a reinforcing cycle.
I have a question, as I've been listening to you, Andy, I'm just really, really excited. I have a journalism background, but am not a journalist. But I just love being able to really connect with that frontline hunger, and really appreciate the way that you linguistically describe things. It's just been delightful to hear you talk. So I'm coming at this from the nonprofit perspective, and a little bit along the line of Lydia's question, and I think it's very provocative, this whole idea of sourcing data in tech-enabled way. But I'm wondering about what the opportunity might be. You obviously work for a nonprofit journalism company, but what the opportunity might be for and maybe even advice for nonprofit organizations to really work much more collaboratively with journalists in sense making of data. And I serve on the board of the Continuum of Care here in the Pikes Peak region. And I could not screenshot fast enough to get your El Paso County data, but I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I would love to get my hands on this to help us as we're working on our temporary strategy to kind of stem what we think is going to be the cliff effect here that you're pointing to. So, I'm thinking, it just occurs to me on this call, there might be some terrific opportunities to sort of freelance moonlight partner with journalists like yourself, where we don't have the bench strength inside nonprofit organizations to do our own research, but there might be opportunities as we begin to know about people like you to say, oh my gosh, are there discrete projects that we could tap your intuition for? Because what we're doing right now is we often go to economists embedded at universities, but it's not the same as the way in which you're approaching it. So sorry for the long question.
No.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm just really stoked with what you have to say.
Yeah, thanks for the question. That's a good one. It makes me wish that we did have more resources for me to turn that spreadsheet into something a little more durable, a data platform where instead of reaching out to me for just with the coronavirus data, I wish that I could set it up in a way that you would just be able to go access it and get what you needed from it. I think that, at this point, there are so few journalists, and they're so overworked that the best way to approach it is almost ad hoc, just calling the ones in your area when they do something relevant. And then I think there's also room for some of the bigger institutions and nonprofits to step in here. And it makes me think of, if you've ever dealt with Shift Research Lab, and they've done a good job of compiling like common resources. I think that's one of the biggest holes that's out there today. And someone asked about data portals. I think one of our greatest needs is for places like Gary Community Foundation, who runs that Shift Research Lab, to acknowledge most places don't have the capacity to do heavy-duty data collection or analysis. We need to figure out what are the common resources that we all use and start putting them together, because that's going to enable a lot more individual projects.
Almost like a wiki. Okay, cool.
Yeah. In terms of open data portals, yeah, I usually literally Google open data Colorado, open data Denver. And sometimes they have what you need, sometimes they don't. The one Denver runs has some really interesting data sets in it about like where are all the street lights, where are all the water fountains, and you can mash them together in some interesting ways. And boy, if I had prepared better, I would tell you some more, but they are out there.
Awesome. All right. Well, I think that we've covered a ton here, and this has been great. So yeah, I think that why don't, just to make sure we end on time, why don't we wrap here? But one thing I'll make sure to do, we've got a recording, so I can share that out. Andy, you want to send me are you comfortable sharing those slides? You want to send those to me, and I could share those out with folks as well?
Yeah, definitely. I'll send those over.
Cool. Awesome. Yeah. And then I guess, Andy, you know, any last comments or anything you want to share with folks before you wrap?
You know what? We always need help, and we don't usually like directly tap people outside the newsroom, but there's no reason that, you know, if you have a great idea or you have a data set that you think is relevant, share it with us, share it with me. And oftentimes that can be the basis of some really great journalism. Like there are so many like huge national features, and like there's so much cool collaboration going on between academics and major papers and publications, and creating a really strong data set can be the basis for 1 million newspaper stories. So if you really want to influence an area, create something and share it with us.
Awesome. Awesome. Yeah, I feel like there's a lot of folks on this call of relevant skill sets who could contribute in some way, either, you know, on finding the data sets or reshaping, creating the pipelines. So yeah, anyway, we really, really appreciate your time today, Andy. And we're so excited to also be using your data for a contest coming up next month. That's going to be a blast. So we'll continue to have some conversation organizing that, but just so appreciate your time. Keep doing the great and important work that you're doing in terms of journalism, especially with an election coming up and all kinds of interesting challenges happening in 2020. And yeah, keep rocking it. Thanks again for spending your lunch hour with us.
Well, thanks for letting me talk. It's a pleasure being with you all.
All right. Thanks again, everybody. Have a great rest of your day. I'll catch y'all later.
Okay, take care, y'all.
Bye.